welcome everyone to this webinar at the SDG Conference 2021. It's entitled "The Fluid Permanence of Urban Habitation," and it is dedicated to something as unique and something as fantastic as the launch of a brand new journal. And I really would like to welcome all of you, and I hope there are many of you. I know there are now more than 3,200 participants at this conference, and I hope many of you have chosen to follow this webinar. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I am the director of the Global Research Program on Inequality. This is a research program dedicated to globally collaborative forms of research on multiple urbanities, also, especially with a focus on inequality. Now, we have a very great number of interesting interventions ahead of us, but before we say a bit more about that, I need to provide you with two pieces of information. So please pay attention and bear over with me. For one, this event will be recorded and will be made available on the conference platform until the end of the conference on Friday, as well as on GRIP's website and on our YouTube channel later on. Secondly, and perhaps a bit more interesting, we do really want this to be an interactive session, and we will therefore have a Q&A session later in the webinar. Please therefore use the Q&A function to post your questions. If you have other comments, please use the chat function for that. And we will make sure to channel your question into the debate that we will have later on. Now, the panel that we have assembled here in relation to the journal represents a diversity of perspectives on a broad field, namely what we call the urban. And as also this whole conference makes clear, to think about both how cities are structured, but also how they comprise conduits or harbor flows have become even more pressing at the current moment when the ongoing virus pandemic arguably transforms all aspects of human life. It has also, however, deeply impacted the multiple inequalities that are weaved into the texture of urban spaces and transformed these, often through forms of what one could label securitization, for instance. This includes, for instance, intensified surveillance practices, cameras, cell phones, heat detectors, we all know this, and includes also the introduction of state practices such as curfew and urban zoning that one would, in a pre-pandemic era, have deemed draconian or at least deeply problematic from a human rights or political perspective. And it also includes questions that relate to the future of cities in a context with perhaps more specialized global mobility or possibilities for migration. And I do hope we will discuss this. With me today, I have both the brains behind the journal Parangolé, as well as several of its contributors. And I think it is only fair to provide them with an opportunity to tell us about the journal and why it really matters. So I have here with me today Alfredo Brillembourg. He's the co-founder of the interdisciplinary architecture firm Urban Think Tank and the founder and editor of the Parangolé journal. He has been a guest professor at Columbia University and also co-held the chair for architecture and urban design at ETH Zurich from 2020 to 2019. I also have Ida with me, Ida Lien here with me today. She's an urban economist and a co-founder of Urban A company working within the fields of humanitarian response and urban development. Together with Synne Bergby from Urban A, Lien has guest edited this first inaugural Motherland issue. So, Alfredo and Ida, please let us know about the journal.
We're very pleased to be here. Let me hold up the journal for those of you who have not seen it. It will be hot on the newsstands as of March 15th through Hanchikant's distribution. Ida?
Oh, let's go on.
So Bjørn, thank you so much for introducing us. And hello, friends in cyberspace. Today, you don't need to live in a city to be urban anymore. Parangolé was conceived as a way of initiating an international dialogue between researchers, practitioners, readers, and we were committed to find articles that would share a critical view of the world in this time of the pandemic and such a difficult time in the world. And as founders of the Urban Think Tank, I've been working and teaching for more than 20 years in Africa, India, and South America. And for this edition, we teamed up with Urban A as editors. And in short, I think Ida can do the best explanation, but Parangolé, in my point of view, is for humanitarians, it's for theoreticians, and it's for architects. And it shows the underlying complexity and realities driving displacement and migration. Ida, take it away.
Thank you, Alfredo. It's a pleasure to introduce Motherland as the first issue of Parangolé journal. It looks at the transitory and permanent conditions of migration and displacement. And here, I think you can see the screen with the map that shows that a select number of countries are hosting a large part of the 41 million internally displaced people, as well as close to 26 million refugees worldwide. And this is in addition to the 272 migrants worldwide. And as we can see, some of these countries host a large number of the displaced and refugee populations, as well as the neighboring countries, such as Venezuela and Colombia, Syria, and we see Turkey and Lebanon, for example, having a large refugee population, as well as in the Democratic Republic of Congo and neighboring Uganda. Thanks to the impressive 25 contributions to Motherland, it has 265 pages with articles, photojournalism, interviews, and projects. I will take you through snapshots of some of the contributions, and then we will shortly hear from our contributors who are with us today. A Long Way Home is a photo essay by Sergei Ponomarev, who's a New York Times photographer. His photos capture the refugees who come to Europe and go across Europe. And as he says, it's about much more than the physical movement of people. It is about shifting identities as nations and people shape one another.
So, sorry, Ida, I just received some comments in the chat that people cannot see your slides. So could you try to, I don't know,
Up the share and
share in a different way? Sorry about that.
No worries,
Sure.
it's all these technical issues in
Let's
the
try
digital
again.
world.
Okay, so we want to share screen now, and can does anyone see them now?
To me, it looks good. If some people in the chat, yes, they say. Okay, sorry about that. Please go on.
Briefly, so you know what I was going on about.
That's okay. We don't
This
have
is the map,
Yeah.
and this is the photo essay. So what Ponomarev was saying is reflected through the contribution in the publication, where critical voices speak about these experiences of movement and the results they have created in the places that are passed through, the places that people are arriving in, and the places left behind. They also speak about the strict measures and enforcements by nation states to control these movements. And as we all know, with COVID-19, this has been further exacerbated and led to a world where we're shutting down our borders and our cities. In their article, Caroline Chiato and Lauren Ladeau looks at these lockdown and limitation of movement measures in Africa as a result of COVID. Moving to Goma, Karen Büscher is describing how Goma has become a city of refuge, where internally displaced persons and returnees are becoming city makers in Goma. We also have Kai Vakla and Jonas König, who are speaking about post-war Pristina in Kosovo, and how this has become what they call a departure city, looking at how the diaspora is still shaping the city through remittance coming back into the country. Then we also have an interview with Marwa Al-Saboni, who's a Syrian architect still living in homes. In this eyewitnessing account of how it is to live and work as an architect in Syria, she also reflects back on how architecture and urban planning has been contributing to the conflict that arose in Syria. And she also makes these wonderful drawings of the state of the city.
Yeah, the destroyed state, yeah.
We also have some examples of how students engage with the issues of displacement, and specifically for the University of Sheffield, they have been working with a refugee camp in Jordan called Satro. And they're looking at how the camp design is impacting or steering social relations, and how different ways of creating this camp structure will also change the social relations in the camp. Then Urban Think Tank with Alfredo is taking us to Israel and Palestine. And they're sharing experiences and stories covering a 7-year span from 2011 to 2018, based on interviews with people on the ground, such as this Palestinian man
holding his key
to
his home.
Yeah. The Motherland is closed by this graphic story by Things Chuck, which is illustrating the detention and deportation situations in Canada. And these are spaces that are largely invisible to the public, but that are quite a big part of the reality for many refugees, migrants coming to countries such as Canada.
And maybe, yes, we have here the 5 presentations that we will be following through with. Go ahead, you can describe a bit of them.
I'll let the panelists do that themselves, but we have Cruz and Fonna Forman who will start the presentation, followed by Irit Katz, Manuel Herz, John Knudsen, and then lastly Bjørn Enge Bertelsen from GRIP.
For me, it's a great pleasure to have these panelists together, because I think the dialogue will be very interesting, but also because some have been longtime friends. And we will start off with Cruz and Fonna, who go back in my life and in my work a great deal. Teddy took us to the border of Mexico very early on when he was beginning his studies on this border condition. And we're so excited to have you here with Fonna and with a new view on what's the border today. Thank you, and I pass it on to Bjørn now, who will, I guess, take it from here. Let's unshare, stop share.
Thank you for that, Ida and Alfredo. And we really actually do look forward to holding a physical copy of this journal in our hand. And but this gave us a fantastic snapshot, I think, of all its important and politically pertinent contents. I also would like to mention that Ida and Alfredo are developing a website for the journal, so it will not only be available in a paper format, or as conveyed through a webinar like this. So we all look forward to that. But as Alfredo said, we will start off with our presentations, and we are very excited to introduce Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman for the first presentation. Teddy Cruz is a professor of public culture and urbanism in the Department of Visual Arts at the University of California, San Diego, and he has conducted extensive urban research at the Tijuana, San Diego border, as Alfredo also said, advancing border neighborhoods as sites of cultural production from which to rethink urban policy, affordable housing, and public space. And Fonna Forman is a professor of political theory and also the founding director of the Center on Global Justice at the University of California, San Diego. And Fonna is a theorist of ethics and public culture, and her work focuses on human rights at the urban scale, climate justice in cities, border ethics, and equitable urbanization in the global south. So Fonna and Teddy, the floor is yours now.
Great.
Thank you so much to Ida and Alfredo and Bjorn for that wonderful introduction. We're delighted to be here with you on the launch of this journal. We're excited also to hold it in our hands. So Teddy and I will tag team. So we really see the San Diego-Tijuana border and the border zone itself as a microcosm of all the injustices experienced by vulnerable people across the globe. Political violence, climate disruption, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, border building everywhere, deepening inequality, and the steady decay of public thinking. We live and work a few miles away from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego-Tijuana has become a lightning rod for American nativism. And though the news cameras have gone, tens of thousands of Central American migrants wait at the wall for asylum that never comes, reviled by the Mexican public as a nuisance and infestation, or else they sit in US detention centers as tools of deterrence, separated forcibly from their children and exposed to a raging pandemic. Maybe there's hope on the horizon, we'll see. But the prospect of border porosity in the next period is drawing even more people north right now, and climate change is sure to accelerate these flows in the next period. Now, against these local atrocities, border communities and activists on both sides of the border continue to confront and productively circumvent unjust power. Much arises informally through everyday collective acts of adaptation and resilience in conditions of scarcity and danger. Over the years, we've accompanied many of these bottom-up emancipatory transgressions and eruptions of democratic will in close partnership with agencies at the front lines. These local struggles here have attracted artists and cultural producers from around the world to engage in acts of performative protest. But we've been mostly critical of this sort of uptick of ephemeral cultural action that kind of dips in and out of the conflict. While the gestures are often creative and provocative, they tend to be extractive in their processes and their impacts on public consciousness as fleeting as the Instagram posts they generate. So what happens the day after the happening? So with our partners, we've been advocating for a much longer view of resistance and more strategic thinking about cultural, institutional, and spatial transformation in the border region. We've constructed an embedded long-term project of cross-border initiatives to tackle these intractable conflicts. Our commitments over the last years have now culminated in a project called the Ucsd Community Stations, essentially a network of public spaces located in vulnerable neighborhoods on both sides of the border, where universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources. We believe that social justice today demands not only the redistribution of resources, but also the redistribution and sharing of knowledges. We have 4 community stations distributed on both sides of the wall. Each is designed, funded, built, programmed, and maintained collaboratively between our university and a grassroots organization. They're all richly curated for dialogue, collaborative research, urban pedagogy, participatory design, build, and cultural production. There's so much to say about all of them, but one of our Tijuana stations is focused particularly on refugee housing, and we'd like to share that one with you right now.
The station is located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement of 92,000 people adjacent to the border wall. I need to take a moment to describe this incredible context. This location is an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyons, which are these fingers here showing the image, clash with the border wall before spilling into an environmentally protected estuary in San Diego, a site now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between the nation and nature, between ecological and political priorities is profound. This site sits 30 minutes from our university and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and poverty that defines our region. Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure, so much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows upstream, ending in the estuary, contaminating this binational environmental asset. Here, the border wall is an environmental insecurity. It's an artifact of environmental insecurity. In the last decades, 70% of the lands, of the open lands in Laureles Canyon have been lost to irregular urban growth. We are advancing an ambitious regional project called the Cross-Border Environmental Commons, a conservation initiative that links the estuary in the US with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the border wall. Another important contextual note is that Laureles Canyon has been the site of our research on informal urbanization through the years. As we have documented over time, the informal settlements of Tijuana are built with the urban waste from San Diego, recycling architectural parts to construct habitation and infrastructure. Over the years as well, we have experimented with factory-made materials, speculating how they might be adapted into acupunctural frames to structurally mediate the recycling of waste. And this is because Tijuana is a site of multinational factories that prey on cheap labor. We have proposed an ethical loop where factories invest in emergency housing. Here we are finally inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquiladora that produces lightweight metal shelving systems for global export, adapting its prefabricated systems into structural scaffolds as armatures for emergency housing. We have tested a variety of prototypes and configurations, illustrating how top-down institutional resources can in fact support the bottom-up creative intelligence of informal urbanization. Now to the station itself. The Ucsd Alacran Community Station is located in the most rugged, precarious, and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesus, a religious organization who began construction of a refugee camp to provide shelter, food, and basic services to hundreds of Haitian and Central American refugees navigating unjust asylum processes in the US and Mexico. With the help of skilled migrants, they began building their own emergency housing. We have established a long-term partnership now with them to co-develop a community station here to increase housing capacity. We are accelerating production of the Mecalux frames to install them on vernacular post and beam concrete systems. The housing scaffolds will be built first, leaving the interiors as planned open systems equipped with utilities to support incremental live-work configurations. These envelopes are the seeds for an evolving sanctuary neighborhood to be infilled through time by the migrant residents themselves. To sustain the construction process over time, we are designing a sanctuary economy, embedding refugee housing in spaces of fabrication, training, small-scale economic development. We have assembled a community-owned construction co-op with the 2 library, wood and metal machines, and a couple of trucks and tractors. They will complete construction of this site and remain operational for future construction jobs across the informal canyon. We began construction last summer, and in this project, we are rethinking, in fact, we began construction last summer, and we wanted to end by saying that through this project and with these projects, we are rethinking the refugee camp beyond shelter to inclusion, to urban inclusion. Migrant camps can negotiate both transition and rootedness, the ephemeral and the permanent. Thank you.
Fantastic, Fonna and Teddy, and so much to think about, both in terms of nature-nation problematics, ephemerality, ethics of representation. We have a lot to discuss later on, so thank you very much. A fantastic project and presentation. We now move on to Irit Katz, and she is an architect and a scholar holding a position of affiliated lecturer in the Center for Conflicts Research, and she's also the director of studies in architecture at, I'm sorry if I mispronounced this, Girton College.
That's Christ now, actually, but
okay. Sorry.
We move between.
At the University of Cambridge. Her work focuses on the socio-political and cultural aspects of architecture and urbanism, and she looks at the processes through which human environments are formed and reshaped in extreme situations, such as forced displacement and violent conflict. So I would assume that there would be lots of similarities between the work of you and Teddy and Fonna, but we can come back to that later on. But now we would like to hear your presentation. Irit, please.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and also thanks to Alfredo and Ida for the invitation for today, and also for the participation, the invitation to participate in your really truly inspiring journal. And also thank you to Teddy and Fonna, and I wish we'll continue later the discussion about what you're doing in the Mexican-US border is truly inspiring. And I have to say that it would be great to continue discussing, the different legal and spatial conditions here in the European borderscapes and in your area. But I have to admit that the photos that I will show now are quite similar to what you've shown at the beginning, that of fortifying borders and of flimsy ephemeral tents and other forms of spatial arrangements in this when people try to find shelter when they're on the move. So I'll just quickly reflect on the reality in Europe back in relation to what happened here back in 2015 and 16, and by quickly reflecting what's going on today in this kind of unfortunate reality. So we usually tend to think about borderscapes as and their ephemerality in relation to this kind of tents that are being erected next to closed borders. When people are trying to move, the borders are closed and being fortified, and people stay there in order to continue to try to continue their movements. But obviously, when we look today, as you were mentioning earlier, at environments of displacement and of human movement, unauthorized human movement, we in many cases find such environments, such ephemeral environments in cities. So this is a tent camp in Paris in 2015, and we can see a similar reality today, a very violent reality in Paris. This is in December 2020, just a few months ago, where there are still encampments in the city, when cities themselves are becoming borderscapes of people on the move. So this reality that I'm going to reflect on now, and I've elaborated about in the journal, is still an ongoing reality, obviously constantly changing as well. So this is a map of camps in northern France. And what we can see here is, and these are the camps created there in between roughly 2014 and 2017. Most of the camps, if not all of them, are already gone. So we're talking really about a constantly changing reality. And what you can see there in the squares of the A, B, and C are the camps, are the actual cities where we can see the movement of camps, their erection, but also their demolition and their movement into other forms of camps. So we can talk about a variety of camps in these urban and non-urban areas of makeshift camps, but also on institutional camps that were created, often in relation to them, to alleviate reality, but also very much to control it. So, we can talk about this kind of relation between the informal and formal more broadly later on, but in many of these cases, you can see the emergence of informal makeshift camps and then the appearance of institutionalized camps, again, in relation to them. So this is here, these realities in Dunkirk, the Basroche camp, and then the Lien camp created by Médecins Sans Frontières in Dunkirk, the jungle camp in Calais, and the container camp created in its heart. We'll see it soon again. And this is the Materol de la Chapelle camp that we've seen earlier. And this is the bubble camp, so-called the bubble, in Paris, created again to host, but also to control migrants and refugees in the area. And this camp, which is institutionalized, institutional camp created in 2017 is already gone. So we are talking again about a quickly changing reality. So this is the Calais jungle in February 2016. And it's important to reflect that when we see these camps, we see images of them, the images are really of the camp in a very particular moment in time. So here you can see part of the makeshift camp, the container camp that was erected only later on. The camp in the past continued until this fence, and then you can see part of it was erased by the authorities. So we really talk about a highly ephemeral reality. And if you look closely on the case of Calais, I showed earlier also the urban analysis of Dunkirk and of Paris. In the past, there was, again, I talk about early 2015, there were camps within the city, these kind of informal encampments, and then the authorities themselves ordered ordered the migrants to relocate their encampments to the area that later on became the jungle. So when we talk about camps and urban realities, these are very much embedded realities and relate one to the other and not necessarily distinct, at least in the cases here. And we can also talk about an ongoing reality of increasing fortification of borders, even if you talk about the border here between the jungle and the road that lead to the port in Calais, a road that was in itself fortified with quite a large investment of the UK. So we're talking here about the Calais and UK border. I'll move on, but it's very much between Calais and Dover, between which these cities migrants attempt to move. So at the time, the jungle included quite an urbanized landscape. Refugees, migrants in the camp really created their own urban environment to allow them to stay in the camp when they were trying to cross, but also in a way that will allow them to manage some kind of life there with actual, civil institutions, restaurants, a church, an Ethiopian church that you can see here, creating a high street of shops and restaurants, a really semi or urbanizing landscape next to within the city of Calais, but next to its center. And we can see also activities of architecture students. You can see drawings here, and other volunteers who helped the refugees to build shelters in the camp. And this is what we see here in this image is one of the back gardens, one of the backyards of one of the houses in Calais, when people were kind of created this informal shelter factory to create shelters for refugees in the camp. And again, this kind of accompanying reality of the authorities creating environments of hospitality, but also of control. So in these environments, care and control go very much together. So the French authorities created this container camp to allow refugees to have a warm shelter in winter. But this is, of course, a sort of a conditioned hospitality, because in order to be hosted in the camp, migrants had to give their fingerprints, therefore marking their bodies in a way that will make it very hard for them in the future to ask for asylum in the UK as they cross. And we can later on talk about the Dublin 3 regulations and why they in the past did not allow asylum seekers to move easily between countries, and how this reality now after Brexit is expected to change. So again, when we talk about such camps, such as the jungle, we talk about a very quickly changing reality between months and sometimes days, when the authorities demolish parts of the camp and refugees and others rebuild them in different ways. So we could see here the stages of the jungle during its existence. And I'll end here by reflecting on the fact that this reality is really a continuous reality. So this is Calais in 2021. The jungle was demolished in 2017, but refugees and other migrants are still trying to cross. So we can see here an even more ephemeral reality, with authorities continuing to demolish shelters as they are erected. And this is a reality which is not, of course, only in Calais, this ephemeral reality, but in other parts of France, as we've seen earlier with the video from Paris. But also when we look at other parts of Europe, we can see a similar reality of ephemerality and exclusion and really difficult conditions in other areas. And this is, for example, a camp in Lesbos, in which people truly live today in these deplorable and truly unacceptable conditions. And we're talking again today about the COVID reality, which also makes part of that. So I will end here, and thank you all again for the discussion. I look forward to the continuation of the discussion today, and hopefully also later on. So, cheers.
Thank you very, very much, Irit. And again, we see pretty disturbing photos of conditions that migrants live in, and also, open up all questions about, again, representation, open up questions about ephemerality and permanence, and the role of NGOs and states, and the management of borders. And we have a lot to discuss later on, I think. We now move on to another contributor, John Knudsen. He's an anthropologist, and he is a research professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen. And he specializes on micro-conflict, displacement, camp-based, and urban refugees in the Middle East. And he works particularly in Lebanon and has published widely on this. So, Are, the digital floor this time is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Bjørn, and thank you to Ida and Alfredo for organizing this. Very happy to be part of this, and I was also very impressed with the other presentations by Irit, Fonna, and Teddy. And it struck me that we are sort of moving down the scale from cross-border approaches to a refugee camp, the famous Calais camp, and now to my example, which is further down the scale. 1 second. Which is my contribution to the Parangolé volume is part of a longer article on generations of refugees squatting in a former hospital. Sorry, it's jumped up here. In a former hospital, the Gaza Ramallah Hospital, built by the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in the late 1970s. So the focus is the changing nature of this hospital, now squatted. But the larger question this article addresses is the problem of housing of urban refugees. Now a majority of refugees live in urban areas and often end up in informal settlements and slums. I will start by giving a few glimpses of this from Beirut, southern part of Beirut, and then I finish with some more general issues that emerge from this study. So the focus of my article is what you can call urban refugees. That's also something to discuss, settled in Sabra, which is Beirut's largest informal settlement. With the Palestinian refugee camp, Shatila, built in 1949, that you can see here in yellow, at its center. Today, Sabra emerges as what can be termed a campscape, combining camps and low-income areas where urban poor and urban displaced live next door. We can see Sabra here in this aerial view, marked in blue, with the refugee camp in yellow and the study area in green in the upper part, with the Gaza buildings hiding behind this red square. So this, as I said, is one of the largest informal areas of Beirut. And if we were able to zoom in this picture, we can also see that some of these buildings are relatively small, which is typical of informal settlements. A lot of smaller houses, while the more regular built-up areas are more Haussmannian, regular built-up areas. In the study area, we find the Gaza buildings shown here. A former hospital complex comprising 4 buildings built by, as I said, by the PLO at the height of their power, ruined in subsequent civil war and conflict, and with medical staff and patients evacuated in 1985. This turned the ruined buildings into a squat for displaced Palestinian refugees. In the post-war period, the Palestinian squatters became de facto owners of the buildings, as the PLO could not afford to refurbish or repossess the buildings. So it meant that the buildings were originally squatted and technically still are, but the PLO gave up repossessing them. So it means that the Palestinian squatters, in a way, became owners of the buildings and individual flats. If we now move fast forward to 2012-13 and the Syrian refugee crisis, the arrival of Syrian refugees in Sabra made some of them settle in these buildings, and they now form a majority in some of them. And they were housed, some of them housed in the new top floors that we can see in this image, an example of what we could call incremental housing that is typical of informal areas. As this image shows, we can, in fact, read this building as a vertical migration history and displacement timeline. We can see here the contours of repeated refugee crises, Palestinian, Syrian, but also the plight of Asian contract workers renting in the hot and humid basement. If we have time, we can come back to the details of how these buildings are run, but most of the buildings are run by influential families that control large sections of the building and rentals and making money from this. So hidden behind these walls is also huge income differentials between poor lodgers and a few rich landlords. Sort of moving out from the specifics of the Gaza buildings, I want to bring up some general points that I think emerge from this study. First, I think there is the need for a sort of shift of perspective from refugee camps to urban refugees. Most of the research has been on refugee camps, and it's a very sophisticated type of research. And we can also see the work of Irit Katz in this way now. But the situation is the plight of urban refugees has still been underrepresented in research. Then there's a problem of affordable housing, which is of course also a major issue for the global development goals. How should we solve the housing needs of the urban displaced? Today, the majority of refugees are living outside camps and often end up renting in informal areas and substandard buildings. This, of course, throws up a challenge both to social scientists, urbanists, and of course, architects. And of course, authorities. But as you know, authorities are not always wanting to accommodate refugees in urban areas. So we have sort of multiple problems for finding solutions to urban residents of refugees. Then there is the issue of what we could call emergency urbanism, which could be understood as all forms of urban self-settlement that sort of contravene building codes and regulations. An example could be squatting, but it's not limited to squatting. Incremental housing, all forms of sort of unregulated building and squatting in often then informal areas. Linked to this argument is, of course, another important fact that refugees are not only city dwellers, they are also city makers, as Muna Fawaz at the American University of Beirut has shown in much of her work from Beirut. They build cities, they do not only live or reside in them. The final point is perhaps seeing housing as a process, what we could call housing as a verb. Something that has been discussed by Romola Sanyal, among others, at SOAS. This sort of reflects the changing form and functions of buildings. In this case, from a modern hospital to a squatted ruin. And one way to do this is by changing the scale and moving towards a close-up of buildings and their residents. Finally, a close-up study of buildings, such as the Gaza hospital, can provide something like we could call a genealogy of displacement. That is a way to understand and approach the changing nature of urban settlement of displaced people and groups, and therefore also a starting point for finding solutions to their housing needs. Thank you.
All right, I am sorry. I'm trying to
come back and
I'm trying to, yes. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Are, for that intervention and for reminding us that migrants do not only live in camps, and we can discuss that later on. The relation between camp, the non-camp, and refugeeness, I guess. We now have the penultimate presenter with us, and that is Manuel Herz. He is a professor of architectural, urban, and territorial design at the University of Basel. He's also the principal of Manuel Herz Architects, and his research focuses on the relation between the discipline of planning and power/state power. So we look forward to hearing from you, Manuel.
Great, great, Bjørn. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for this invitation. I'm super happy to be in this circle of cool colleagues and great friends. I want to start by sharing a presentation with you. Let's see. And I'll also be sharing a story regarding a camp or a collection of camp that has somehow fallen off the radar, if one can say this. It has even fallen off the map of the magazine, unfortunately. That dot needs to be put in, maybe in all the copies by hand. I'll ask you to insert it. Anyway, we are where are we? We're in the Western Sahara. The Western Sahara used to be a Spanish colony just at the western edge of the African continent until 1975, when Franco, on his deathbed, made a gentleman's agreement with Morocco to invade the country and to recolonize the local population, the so-called Sahrawis, who started a guerrilla war and had to flee across the border into Algeria in 1976, since when they have been living there for more than now 45 years in camps. The camps are very complex and with the long duration, obviously, what distinguishes them maybe from all other camps across the globe, or from most other camps, is that they are self-organized. UNHCR has hardly been involved. I don't want to do a portrait of the camp, but I want to single out one feature which I find fascinating. And I'll start with this image because, in a way, we know this image. It's a gate to control access to the camp. What is different with this image is that, or with this gate, is that it's not manned by either the host army, i.e. Algeria in this case, or by UNHCR, but it's the refugees themselves that keep control who has access to the camps and who doesn't. And this is an indication of a wider phenomena, which is also quite unique and manifests itself in this Camp Rabouni. So altogether, there's about 5 or 6 camps hosting 160,000 Sahrawi refugees. And when we go into Camp Rabouni, what we find is remarkable. For example, this image shows the parliament of the Sahrawis, where the Sahrawis living in exile are establishing a parliament that allows them to govern themselves. We see this building, the Ministry of Construction, the Ministry of Culture, or the National Archive. So in this Camp Rabouni, we find, in a way, all the whole tool set that any other sovereign nation needs to govern itself, and in this case, a nation of refugees living in exile. This map shows the whole kind of governmental instruments that the refugees have constructed over the last 40 years. It not only leads to a situation where the refugees are managing their own lives in exile, but it has also led to a certain kind of normality in the very, very unnormal situation of life in exile. So every morning, the refugees from the residential camps arrive at the central bus station, go to work in the ministries, and at lunch, when they don't like the food in the ministry canteens, they eat a yummy camel meat sandwich in this fast food store. And in the evening, they take the bus back to the residential camps. So this kind of everyday routine beyond the fact that they are in exile governing their own lives is a quite a kind of remarkable situation. It has also led to something that I find very extraordinary, a certain kind of semi-sovereignty that exists, or let's say an overlay of multiple sovereignties, which would take more time to untangle. But just to say a few words, we have, of course, Algerian territory, where Algeria is still kind of in charge or holds sovereignty, but they have allowed the Sahrawi refugees to establish their own semi-sovereignty on Algerian property, while the Sahrawis also demand the return of the Western Sahara, and are in fact also governing parts of the occupied Western Sahara that is also partially governed by Morocco illegally. So we have a very much an intricate interweaving of semi-sovereignties, partial sovereignties, which I think is interesting as a kind of invention of new forms of governance and new forms of sovereignty. I had the opportunity to present this at the Venice Biennale 2016, where I, together with the women's organization of the National Union of Sahrawi Women, we established this national pavilion of the Western Sahara, in a way marking nation status for a nation that doesn't have access to its own territory. And the central device of representation were these big tapestries that were woven through a large collective women weaver organization in the camps, in the refugee camps, and depict the spatial production of the refugees by themselves in the camps. The carpets are very thick. They smell of camel wool, and show these different scales of spatial production. In the inauguration of the Venice Biennale, it was wonderful to see Fatma Mehdi, the head of the National Union of Sahrawi Women, in her camouflage dress in front of this slightly camouflage carpet, celebrating how we can also use a kind of an architectural intervention of the pavilion as a kind of political demand for nation status for a nation that was not recognized and that is still not recognized. And we ran into a whole lot of conflict with the chief curator of the Venice Biennale. But I think it is exactly this conflict and this discourse that was very productive and an outcome of the presence at the Venice Biennale. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I have to unmute myself. We are, of course, as all good conferences and workshops, we're running a bit over time. I have myself on the presentation list, but I'll try to be brief so that we can actually have some time to discuss. And I again would like to invite those digital participants who I see are watching to post their questions in the Q&A channel below. I also would like to share a screen, and I'll see if I can be able to do that. And do let me know if you don't see this. I have done work in Maputo in Mozambique for a long time. I come at this as an urban anthropologist and an anthropologist concerned with violence and urban ordering. And I would like to first say that, as we have also seen, our global cities are becoming transformed, not just due to migration, but in other ways as well. There is a widespread privatization of urban space, and the prime examples are places like this. This is the Apollonia City of Light, a privately engineered, privately built city meant to hold 100,000 upper middle class and middle class people in Accra. In essence, siphoning off the middle class from Accra. This is the City of God Church in Nigeria, it's a city that started as a charismatic church. Now they're developing policing services, banking services, and real estate around this. So again, in a sense, a city built from below, again, a privately run city, but not one similar to the first one. And this is the projected Mormon city in Florida, meant to hold 500,000 people, and they have all their permits in order, and they hope to be building this in the next few years. So these are, in a sense, very visible and tangible examples of the privatization of the urban, of enclaving in a sense. But there are also other forms of enclaving that I would like to alert you to. These are the forms of enclaving that shoot through poor areas. And they insert, as you can see here in this image, a vertical hierarchy in a one-story area. This is taken from Bairro Mashakene in Maputo. And here is another example. This almost looks like a penitentiary to your left, and you see these big buildings that are then erected in these poor areas. And there is another example. And there is yet another example. And what I want to alert you to is a few simple facts. That is that we have what we should bear in mind when working with the SDGs and with the Agenda 2030 is this. These transformations that are occasioned by capitalist transformation are closely tied to how the SDGs have been translated in practice in places like Maputo. I've worked with people in this area for more than a decade, and they are really frustrated by the imposition of these vertical enclaves and what they see as the imposition of a combination of resilience on the one hand and inequality on the other. And resistance to these kind of developments often come in the form of young men and sometimes women who form so-called teams Even in Portuguese, Mozambican Portuguese, they're called teams. And these are gang structures that belong to an area and who often roam streets and alleys, often in cars. And I would just like to quote Tiago, a team member here. You can all read his quote in front of you. The point is that they see this imposition of enclaving, this urban reconfiguration, as a form of an imposition of making them become lesser human beings. Yeah? And in opposition to this, they emphasize movement, vitality, uncapturability. And indeed, they often have a rowdy presence in many areas of Maputo. They roam around, they drink heavily, and they often have blaring loudspeakers. And they also make their presence felt on the urban order. These are team tags like Team Stress Punk and Team Suicida in Maputo. So why is it important for us to consider teams in a place like Maputo? Can we not just think of this as the perennial frustration of the poor? I think we should pay attention to this for at least two reasons. For one, as I've already mentioned, this is how SDGs can become instrumentalized and be part of new forms of repression and hierarchy within contexts such as Mozambique. So this is something we should consider. Secondly, Tiago and others react to the futurelessness of how resilience is communicated. There is no horizon of possibility. There is no horizon of development. The promise of revolution are gone from the agenda. And this futurelessness is particularly problematic in a context that has little resources, is riddled with crime, and where elites are appropriating all the resources they can get. So there is something about the whole rhetoric of resilience and its futurelessness, its insistence, you could say, on a particular present that is deeply problematic. And I think we need to address both the SDGs in the urban if we want to tackle this. So very short presentation, and I kept it deliberately short, but I just wanted to mention this. All right, I think we can all now move back into the this communal digital room that we have, and I see lots of faces. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Do we have any questions in the chat? Maybe you, Alfredo, have some questions or reflections for us, having heard our presentations.
Yeah. It was such a pleasure to see how it's like it was a string of pearls. I mean, each presentation was so well linked with the next one. Are, as he said, I'll begin there, said a shift of perspective. In what way? I just want to put that as a frame. Teddy's talked about we got to shift the perspective also in the past and maybe realign the terms of engagement. I believe, Teddy, and you can address that later. And housing needs, informal cities, ephemeral cities, refugees in urban areas, emergency urbanism, some of the terms that came up, squatting, incremental housing, city makers versus city dwellers, housing as a process, change the scale, close up, Tenny, Fonna, and Are said, new forms of sovereignty, Herz and Katz, borders, divisions, cities built from below versus cities built as a master plan, enclaving, Maputo, as Bjorn's presentation, SDGs can become instrumentalized with resilience, the future of lessness, or is it the future is less and more, or more and less, more or less? So I open up the floor. Bjorn, maybe you want to throw out a question individually, or I could, or Ida could do that, of course.
Yeah, no, I have one question. I mean, I found all these, I mean, the whole relation between ephemerality and fixedness. Yeah, I mean, this is the big, one of the big tensions in approaching urban orders. And I really like this this presentation that Irit had on the jungle, but also Fonna and Teddy's, and of course Manuel as well, and Are, all sort of, in a sense, describe various forms of, you could say, contested ossification of the urban. Yeah, I mean, there is a drive towards fixedness that is constantly challenged in different ways. So I was reminded about Teresa Caldeira's argument about sort of auto-construction, which has been appropriated in many places and in many contexts. And I was just wondering, is auto-construction as a pilot to gentrification, which is her argument, is that only allowed auto-construction in places where gentrification will then be implemented afterwards? In a sense, I mean, this whole idea of auto-construction, is it an auto-construction that is premised upon a future gentrification? Is that what we're seeing in the different places?
Who wants to pick that up? Teddy, Manuel, Edith.
I guess I can just say quickly that, you know, in our context, obviously these informal settlements are open air housing factories of self-built infrastructure and so on. When these environments are treated as individual atomized units of people themselves as individuals constructing their own environments, it can quickly obviously transform into the typical neoliberal process that really does not embrace collective, let's say, priorities in this sense. And that's the reason for us it's been essential to construct in tandem with a lot of these interventions, social networks to really coordinate horizontal sort of relations, to maintain certain levels of guarantee, let's say. So the check and balances that is opened through a cross-sectorial, not only beyond the informal settlement, of accountability of institutions, let's say, but also inside the informal settlements. You know, Hernando de Soto a long time ago already amplified the idea that, you know, the mystery of capitalism, right? That somehow these environments, you know, that we should really embrace the informal, in this case, to mobilize economic sort of processes. But as Mike Davis at some point reacted to Hernando de Soto said, but yet that cannot be done without certain levels of coordination by social agencies. Otherwise, we will continue to perpetuate just by giving individual lending, let's say, because people will retrofit their own house, sell it, and move to the next informal settlement. And so yes, it's a very complex issue, but I think the idea of collective property and certain levels of local governance, I think, are important to really avoid gentrification. We are very much focused on that possibility.
Great, thank you, Teddy. We have a question related also, in a sense, to property here from one of our participants, and this goes for Manuel, actually. We have a question from Bernardo Almeida, and he writes, in these informal ministries in Western Sahara, did you find responsible land administration, and or how are land rights regulated and organized? I mean, this is also a big question in all these camps, I would guess. Yeah, I mean, how is land or plots controlled, or how do borders, boundaries, sense of ownership emerge? Yeah? But Manuel first.
Yeah, great question. In fact, it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that is created in the camp. The question of land ownership, it's maybe one of the largest settlement, 160,000 refugees, where land cannot be owned, and where land ownership, if a kind of monetary land ownership falls out of the equation, then different dynamics, different dynamics are set into place to negotiate kind of who has control over which plot. And first of all, there is money circulating in the camps, obviously, no surprise, but land, because A, it's a camp, and B, the territory belongs to Algeria, can never be bought. And if 2 or 3 families want to build on the same plot within the camp, that can easily happen. Then money is not you can't kind of overbid your neighbor as you could in any other kind of settlement. So there is a semi-formalized kind of ritual of negotiation and mediation of who has more right or who needs that plot of land more urgently. And then a kind of a marking process really physically takes place of marking out that plot, and then construction takes place. So this is quite fascinating, kind of what happens if ownership, a monetary-based ownership, falls out of the equation. But I want to maybe, if I can, go also to Bjørn's question or about self-built and gentrification. I think gentrification in the case of the camp in Western Sahara, it's maybe one of the very few places where gentrification is not a danger, because it's, I don't know, 60, 80 kilometers away from the nearest settlement. It's a very inhospitable place. Very few people, I guess, would like to gentrify this place. But other contradictory processes have kind of fallen into place out of consequence of this self-built. And I just want to name one, because the urban fabric that the Sahrawis have built for themselves is very stable and the services are very good. The kind of crisis has been averted. There's no more death, and of course people are dying in the camps, but more or less for natural causes and not for hunger or disease. And this kind of prevention of crisis, also because of a very good self-built environment, has led to a situation where you don't need to solve the conflict anymore, where you don't need to solve the crisis anymore, because there's no political international pressure anymore to resolve the Western Sahara conflict, because of a kind of a stabilization through self-built initiatives of the refugees. And this contradiction is very frustrating, and the refugees are aware of that themselves.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question, but and that's to Teddy and Fonna. But before going there, would you like to comment on any of these issues, Irit and Ara?
Yeah, I'll be happy to, just as a quick note, to say that I think this question of gentrification and ephemerality against a more permanent reality is really dependent on context. And I would be interested to further kind of explore the different conditions in the French-UK border in relation, for example, to the reality in the Mexican-US border. I mean, the situations there are very different. As we've seen, I mean, the jungle does not exist anymore, and currently the refugees in the area of Calais, there are around 1,500 people there. The police really does not allow them to build anything. They continue to demolish their even flimsy tents and shelters and keep them de facto on the move. So I think it's really important to compare between these contexts. And just a note to say that in a way, inhabitation becomes not even a form of resilience, but more than that, becomes a form of resistance in a reality that even people are suspended, en route. They're not allowed to create even the minimal, environments from themselves, like the jungle has been. So I think we should see this kind of actions of inhabitation as a form of resistance to this imposed reality of movement and suspension without any basic conditions. Another maybe a quick comment on gentrification. I think in other refugee camps, again, it's very much dependent on context, but the humanitarian money and the development money around the refugee camps brings to a whole network of support. Jensen has done a really important work around it in the camps in Kenya, and then there is a whole kind of dependence of local communities on these camps, and the UNHCR themselves are developing other such form of combining humanitarian support and development, creating, for example, the Kalo-Bay mixed or shared settlement, which is supposed to be shared, created in advance in order to be shared between refugees and locals. So yeah, I'll end here.
Great, Irit, very important points. Are, would you like to comment or?
Yes, thank you. I think what Irit said was very interesting. And in fact, this whole Sabra area is sort of supported by humanitarian aid over a longer period of time. So it's not only the refugee camp as such, Shatila, but also many of the people there have, benefit from UNRWA and UNHCR. So it's in a way, this humanitarian system is sort of underwriting this sort of vast informal area. What I would say that there's not a sort of of course, there's no state-led gentrification in this area, but there's an internal one. And this will not come as a surprise to people who work with informal areas or slums, but with a huge income differentials between people living in this area. So you will be struck by the big difference in sort of the quality and layout of flats within the same house. Also, some people manage to make this into an economic opportunity. So you have like people doing sort of rent and reconstruction cycles, getting rents from rentals, and then rebuilding within this area where there is less sort of a formal control of buildings. So it's an area where the state rules exist, but they are then not, not enforced. And I think this is an interesting point made again by Mona Fawaz, who works on urban issues in Beirut, saying that traditionally you would think like the sort of that you would sort of give people, you should regularize these areas, you should make them formal. But it seems that in many cases people prefer to keep them informal. That may give them greater protection through clientelism to keep their houses and homes, which are all squatting on illegal, squatting on private or public land. So this is an interesting issue. If regularization and gentrification as such would be an advantage or not, or would actually weaken, or they could be displaced by, let's say, commercial enterprises.
Very good point. Strategic informalization, yeah, or informality. I think we should take one of the questions from our participants, Lou Elena Bouy. Apologies for pronunciation, probably wrong. She has brought up the spectre of climate change and the Anthropocene into our discussion. And she writes, thank you all for a fantastic series of projects and research. A question to Teddy and Fonna. Transnational/border considerations of our lands and rivers, especially when they're used as edges, boundaries, is fascinating and especially relevant in the Anthropocene. How are you imagining that this and our related border integration infrastructure might change and evolve with increasing fluxes of climate displacement at the US-Mexico border? And I assume climate transformation and horizons for the next 10, 20, 30 years are relevant to all of us. But please, Teddy and Fonna.
Sure. So, one of the things that natural systems accomplish in a region like ours is they create a more elastic civic sensibility on both sides of the border. Our destinies are sort of intertwined by the environmental systems that unite us. And one of the sort of key elements of mine and Teddy's work over the years is to try to elevate sort of mutual understanding on both sides of the border that we're sort of on this ship together. Now, climate change is accelerating these dynamics. A recent United Nations survey of arriving migrants at the southern border in the United States, 74% of arrivals came from agricultural from the agricultural sector, and identified agricultural instability in Central America as one of the factors in their decision to walk north. So that's going to accelerate in the years to come. And arriving migrants in this region tend to settle in, environmentally sensitive zones that accelerate the kind of clash of, again, nature versus nation in this region. So like cooperation in so many places in the world, people come to realize they need to do it once they begin to experience the negative impacts of not cooperating. So resilience, this idea of resilience that has become so ossified in global development sort of discourse. In our region, we've been really trying to, communicate that resilience requires a platform of collaboration. It's not just about physical interventions and policy. It's about figuring out mechanisms of working together on these challenges. So what we anticipate in the next period as the climate change impacts accelerate is that, people on both sides, both top down and bottom up, will really invest in these cross-border networks of collaboration. It's become inevitable.
And that's the reason I think that for us, the border has always been a place to seek, obviously, new strategies of interdependence. And those set of interdependencies and the models, let's say, of coexistence need to be visualized. They are not that easily, we have been developing projects in a sense that really visualize those shared assets. In fact, through them, begin to challenge the reductive and essentialist sort of conceptions of citizenship as defined by the imposition of the nation state, of the identitarian politics in terms of communities, but really elevating the shared interests and common values in divided territories, right? If we are going to understand that those shared environmental systems, beginning with hydrology and beyond, that are essential to really shape that intertwined future. Now, that might seem naive, but this is really establishes potentially a new period where maybe empathy might be a political tool. And I think that this, I'm glad that the question really identified something that there was no time to really elaborate, but the cross-border commons, which in fact really exposed the border wall, right, in the last years when it was really increasing its sort of imposition as a self-inflicted wound, not only separating ourselves from the other, but also is inflicting huge havoc on our own environmental systems, obviously the ones that should be shared with a neighbor. And in this case, we began to bundle remaining pieces of land in the informal settlement that hadn't yet been squatted into an archipelago of conservation to protect the estuary on the other side of the wall, right, the rich estuary. And the state of California spends $12 million cleaning that estuary every year because of that havoc. And instead of building the wall, we argued, can we collaboratively invest in informal settlement? And so in that archipelago of conservation, restoration of habitat, the transformation of environments into micro-infrastructures for waste and water management is possible. And guess what? Now our refugee camp has a construction cooperative with the machines to now do the job. So this is about the connection between sanctuary economy, habitat restoration, and cross-border interdependence begin to be tied together into a potential system. Now it's complex, but that's really what we are pursuing to do here.
Excellent.
If I could add just something really quick, I think it's important to, again, realize that the conditions, not only the contexts are different from one another, but also the environmental, but also political conditions around these borderscapes, which change all the time. And I think in relation to that, I've read just a couple of days ago, and I quote here from Climate Home News website, that Biden orders advisor to explore options for resettling climate migrants. So, it's already within the US politics that that policies possibly might change in relation to this kind of movement. And obviously the World Bank is expecting around 140 million people to be displaced until 2050 by the climate crisis. So I'm sure that our discussions in the future, unfortunately, will be around this as well.
Yeah, I trust you're right. No, please, Alfredo.
Cities aren't ready. Sorry, I just wanted to say people are on the move. That's what Parangolé comes from. It's from Oiticica, the Brazilian artist, and some of you might know him, and who worked in favelas, and he came up with this term from the favelas, where the faveladores, which was Parangolé slang for movement, bodies in movement. So that's where the whole title comes from. So I was just saying, there will this movement will not stop. It has never stopped over the centuries. So what are those policies? And we know things are going to get a lot worse, right? And so maybe the reality of the favelas in Caracas created the political framework that Venezuela is in. So in other words, maybe that the idea of no tenureship but collective tenureship, or let's say anonymous tenureship, was captured by some kind of political entity that was able to lobby that mass, because they were invisible to a point, but they became so visible after another point. So I think that it's interesting that what you're saying, that you're saying there's a contextualization between actually the morphology, the environmental, either morphology of the land or the urbanization, and the politics who are mounted on top. How will we somehow navigate or mold or layer those two things together?
If I may add just for a moment, I meant to emphasize that those $12 million, sorry to talk about this for a moment, but it's about this counterintuitive thing, right? Can some of that money be redirected? I hope that was implied to the informal settlement. It's counterintuitive to American institutions. But we were making the argument that is to protect the estuary, which is a shared bioregional asset, right? But what is interesting here in terms of movement and and permanence in all of what we were discussing, which is very problematic, obviously complex. But with our activist partners in developing this particular community station, one of them said at some point something really fundamental here, because many of these Central American refugees were waiting for years, right, trying to get to an appointment for asylum. They said, we are fighting, these activists, we're fighting obviously to defend the rights of the migrant to migrate, to move, right, displaced because of political strife or climate vulnerability, etc. But now we're understanding that we also need to be fighting for the rights of the migrant to remain if they decide to, if they choose to. And we need to open up the sort of platform of opportunity instead. So the idea of economy embedded into a refugee camp, not necessarily only the informal economy, but a more committed, rooted, long-term set of availabilities so that they are co-owners of the means of production. And in this case, by having the investment of the other country in this type of projects, I think that began to advance what we are calling here beyond shelter and into inclusion.
But Irit's point, I mean, the political, all of these dynamics are happening against a political backdrop of rising nationalism. And so you've got this tension between, nation states hunkering down on sovereignty and an increasing and accelerated need for people on the move to be welcomed into new spaces. And this is really going to be the clash of the next decades, figuring out how to navigate those tensions. They're not easy. It's not clear how that's going to resolve, because right now we're still operating in a model of charity where the nation state will sort of open a kind of charitable space when the migrant arrives, but what happens the next day? And I think the whole question of formalization and integration and ultimately equity is not at all resolved.
Definitely, if I may add, I think we shouldn't see, the will to move and the will to stay, in a dignified manner as two contradicting rights. I mean, we are allowed to move, and we are also allowed to stay in a dignified way. And the human geographer Jonathan Darling is discussing what he calls politics of presence, which argues for both the right to move and the right for a dignified stay. So I think we should think about these terms together. And I very much embrace what you said earlier about the fact that we should think about these related spaces as spaces which are designed for something which is beyond hospitality and considers both the movement and the will and ability to stay.
Thank you for clarifying that, Irit, because obviously they shouldn't be exclusive of each other. That's what this activist was suggesting very intuitively. So thank you.
I think we brought out the key tensions towards the end now. I mean, the right to stay and the right to move, ambulation and residence, and also ephemerality and permanence in a sense. Yeah, I mean these are key tensions that we have discussed here today, and they characterize the work of Parangolé, I think, and all our works also collectively. And now this draws the whole thing to an end. I mean, we have had until 5 o'clock, and I think we should give ourselves a round of applause collectively. Should we try that?
Yeah.
Thank you all.